Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Scully, contributing editor at The Hill, and thank you for joining us for our program today. It is titled Healthcare Innovations, the Next Big Breakthrough. And over the course of the next 2 hours, we will be highlighting and demystifying the latest healthcare breakthroughs. What creative avenues can expand access to care? How might technology address future health threats? What treatments and cures are on the horizon? And how might the therapeutics improve the quality of our lives? We will put these questions and more to our exciting lineup of speakers, and we want to thank our sponsor, Hologic, for their support of today's program. Now, before we get underway, a couple of housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events. Use the hashtag #TheHillHealth, and we are broadcasting live. We'll be taking your questions during the course of this program. From semiconductor chips for medical technology to needed medications, the modern medicine is reliant on a complex series of issues and often the global supply chains. Also, the COVID-19 pandemic and the recent shortage of medications like Adderall have put the supply chain issues consistently in the headlines. And so today we will begin with a discussion on how to innovate. And so at the moment, we're going to go to our sponsor perspective on all of this, Hologic, who has been instrumental in putting this all together. And we'll have much more of our conversation during the course of the next 2 hours. But first, this.
So this is sort of Hologic's brag wall.
Yes, our wall of innovation, we call it.
Yeah. It sounds to me that you believe Hologic is a disruptive company, and you are proud of that.
As Hologic gets bigger, we affect more women around the world. I genuinely believe we're sort of this combination of just doing great stuff in the world, and we do make money, and that's okay. When the bigger we get, the better we are for women's health. We're impacting everybody, all women's lives, and then by definition, every man has a woman in their life, so it connects us in so many ways.
Can you talk about the mission of this company, helping women at every stage of their lives?
We start with our purpose, which is to enable healthier lives everywhere, every day. Starting really in the teen years, with our, all of our sexually transmitted infection testing and everything else that is so critical to ultimately women being healthy when they get into the reproductive stage and everything else. And then we go into the lifelong testing of both Pap testing, HPV testing, and then of course mammograms and the innovations we've had in mammograms through to bone density, certainly more critical as women age. And then we also have our surgical division, which treats abnormal uterine bleeding, fibroids.
Why are 3D mammograms such a game changer?
Part of the magic of our 3D mammography is it's both increased the detection of early stage cancers, anywhere from 20 to 62% in various studies. But more importantly, it's also reduced false positives by 42%.
I think some women might hear that and think, oh, I wonder if my doctor has that machine, or gosh, that sounds expensive.
In the grand scheme, when you amortize the cost of the machines over time, they end up, frankly, not even being more costly. And they're saving the healthcare system money because we've reduced all of these false callbacks. We're also reducing all these follow-up. So in fact, we've ended up getting most of the insurers and systems around the world to endorse it because they actually see it's a cost savings to the total system. Now, what's still fascinating though, and this is why, and it's the purpose of Hologic, and we've had to be the ones to fight for that. The systems around the world, the governments don't automatically adopt these. And in fact, if you even look in the United States, there's this thing called the United States Preventative Services Task Force. So we're now a decade into 3D mammography. Tons of data, tons of published studies, tens of millions of women have been helped. They still, in the United States, are considering 3D investigational. You've got a bunch of men making decisions, and it just always feels to me like when these are women's health issues, they just don't move at the same pace.
What are your hopes and dreams for the company?
I felt like Hologic was in the right place at the right time to make a profound impact on the world and women's health. And that was October of 2019, 3 months before the pandemic hit. What's fascinating about how we've responded over the last couple of years is I think we're even in a stronger position to make that impact in the world. Because of our COVID response, we're so much better known at all the highest levels of governments around the world. And we're able, therefore, to be talking about women's health in ways that they never really engaged before. And that magic, I think, is on the precipice that I think we can make a bigger difference in the world. We're going to affect more lives. It's magical to work for a company that you know is making such a difference.
And so that video gives you a real sense of cutting-edge medical technology. Our thanks to Stephen McMillan, who is the president of Hologic, and of course Katie Couric in introducing us to how that technology is helping to save lives with early detection. My next guest is Alyssa Sue Lynch. She is the global lead of Google Cloud's MedTech Strategy and Solutions. We should also point out that she was recently recognized by Fierce Healthcare as one of the most influential minority healthcare executives in 2022. Now, some background: Google Cloud has collaborations with a number of Fortune 500 companies, as well as a number of smaller startup companies, and I spoke with her a short while ago about technology and prevention. Alyssa Sue Lynch is joining us from Seattle. Thank you very much for being with us on behalf of thehill.com, and I really want to talk about technology and the impact it has on hospitals, on doctors, and on patient care. But I want to begin with how it impacts the data that these parties receive, and also on the issue of innovation that we're seeing, because it plays such a huge role in the care that we're receiving today.
Sure. So happy to be here. So I work at Google, and one of the things that we are really focused on across the company is helping billions of people be healthier. And we're doing that across a number of our platforms that are all really data-driven. So things like Google Search, YouTube, Verily, Google Ventures, Fitbit, and then Google Cloud, which is the part of the organization that I'm in. And within Google Cloud, we are partnering directly with healthcare and life science organizations to really help solve their challenges using our technologies, which include helping them with data, analytics, and artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning. So, I know the topic we wanted to talk about today is innovation, in particular related to preventative healthcare. And one of the challenges that we're really trying to solve with preventative healthcare is getting people to adopt healthier behaviors. And this is really critical. So healthier behaviors like eating healthy, managing your weight, being physically active, getting enough sleep. This is really critical because 80% of health actually happens outside of the hospital. But the healthcare organizations that we are partnering with don't necessarily have visibility to what patients are doing outside of the hospital. So it's really hard for them to impact the patient behaviors to ensure that they're actually pursuing those healthy habits that can lead to more preventative healthcare. So one of the things that we recognize is that this data that patients have outside of the hospital is really, really valuable. And advancements in technologies like wearables, consumer wearables, sensors, even digital apps, really there's a lot of data that's being generated about patients that's outside of the hospital that would be super valuable for healthcare organizations to have. And so that's one of the big focus areas for us, is enabling healthcare organizations to get access to that patient data with user consent, and then providing them with the analytics, the insights, the AI to make sense of that data so that they can provide insights to care teams to take better care of patients.
So let me follow up on that point. What can the patient do with that data? What do doctors and nurses do with that? And can it essentially speed up a potential diagnosis for that patient?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think patients having that data in their own hands is really valuable for them to be able to take more accountability for their own health, to be able to track and measure what they're doing, and also just to get reminders. So Google acquired Fitbit in 2021, and Google Fitbit is a really great tool as a wearable to promote behavior change, to encourage people to pursue those healthy habits that they're doing well, but also to give them nudges, to remind them, hey, maybe you should go, get up and go for a walk. So I think for patients, that data is really valuable. For doctors and nurses and healthcare organizations, that data can be really valuable if it gives them insights. Because what we've heard from healthcare organizations is we don't just want the data, we want the insights, and help us with the data. So that's something that at Google Cloud we focus a lot on. Is we want to try to make it easier for them to interpret that data in a way that's meaningful and that it's actionable.
You are absolutely right about Fitbit, because I know in my own circle of friends and family, it's, oh, yep, it's time for a walk. I need to go out. I'm wondering, though, is there data that says this is really working, that this technology is encouraging, forcing, reminding people, take that walk, go for a swim, watch your weight, all the things that you're talking about in preventative care and health?
Yeah, so we just introduced a new solution that's called Device Connect for Fitbit, that brings the power of Fitbit. So think about Fitbit as being able to bring that data collection capability and combining that with Google Cloud and our data processing capabilities. So we're offering this to healthcare and life science organizations so that they can get access to the Fitbit data, do the analytics and insights, and then follow up with patients. So actually use that data to follow up with patients, to intervene when they need to, and then also to be able to measure those outcomes. So I think that's critically important, what you brought up in terms of how do you actually know whether it's working. So I think it's tools like these that will enable healthcare organizations to actually not just reach out to patients, but be able to track and measure their progress.
And I'm wondering if you can assess COVID-19, 2.5 years into this pandemic. It has impacted every American in either a big or small way, directly or indirectly. In your world with Google, how has COVID changed your approach, your research, and the technology?
Yeah, so COVID has changed so many things for all of us, but I think what we've seen from the organizations we're working with is a much bigger focus on data and leveraging real-time data to give them insights. For example, we're working with an organization called Q Health that makes at-home readers. And they came to Google Cloud to really ask, can you help us predict where the next hotspot's going to be? Where is the next outbreak going to be? Because we have this great data, testing data, diagnostic data, but we want to be able to help the government understand where might that next outbreak be. So we've been partnering with organizations like them, directly with the government, with other institutions, really to unlock the power of data to be able to be more predictive and to provide more insights during COVID-19, just about the pandemic in general.
And as you well know, when it comes to research and technology, often there are different silos. I'm wondering, with your partners, are you able to share that information, share that data for the common good?
So we do make available a number of public data sets, including social determinants of health data sets. But really, our Google Cloud approach is we don't own the data. Our customers own the data. So we certainly facilitate conversations. We love to be part of collaborations where we're enabling stakeholders across the healthcare ecosystem to be able to share information, share learnings, and share their data with each other. But just to clarify, Google Cloud, we ourselves do not own that data, and we're very careful about that because it is often patient data that we're not allowed to touch.
And again, keeping in mind any confidentiality issues, but as you go through this data and study it, for somebody who's been so immersed, what has surprised you? What has stood out in your own world?
Yeah, so one of the areas that I've really been spending a lot of time on is AI, so artificial intelligence for medical imaging. So this is a really critical area, particularly as it relates to preventative care, because medical images, so think X-rays, CT, MRI scans, these are used to screen and diagnose patients every day for diseases, for COVID-19, X-rays of the lungs. And medical images are really critical, and they're really large. They sit in silos across organizations, and they're not very useful for AI unless we can enable interoperability, drive some standards around it. And so that's one of the focus areas we've been looking at, is enabling medical imaging AI, because it is data that's growing. It comprises about 90% of all healthcare data, and it's growing, and that's increasing the burden for healthcare workers. So we've heard a lot during the pandemic about the burden that healthcare workers are under, and it's the radiologists, it's the researchers that are tasked with interpreting these medical images in order to provide patient care. And we know that AI can actually enable faster, more accurate diagnosis of these medical images, but companies need help with developing the AI. So we are, introducing technologies. For example, we just introduced our medical imaging suite that is designed to help healthcare organizations accelerate development of AI so they can get to that faster, more accurate diagnosis, help increase productivity for healthcare workers. And just one example, we're working with Hackensack Meridian Health. They are a network of providers in New Jersey, and they're using these tools and technologies for earlier detection of metastasis in patients with prostate cancer. And this is a life-threatening outcome that disproportionately affects Black men in the US. So by leveraging AI, they are looking to be able to detect this much earlier, so then they can help intervene and prevent diseases like that. So I think it's a good example of just how powerful AI can be, but the healthcare ecosystem really needs help with these newer emerging technologies, and that's something that we focus a lot on.
I want to come back to that point, and thank you very much for being with us as you join us from Seattle and talk about the work that you're doing with Google Cloud. But how do you deal with the health disparities?
Yeah, so I think, technology has really enabled a lot of good. Technology now enables us to have information at our fingertips anytime, anywhere we are. And, in thinking about that, Google really believes that information is also a determinant of health. So there's been a lot of talk about the social determinants of health and disparities in care. And we believe that information is a determinant of health and can actually help lead to better, more equitable care. So how are we addressing this? So some ways are, we recognize that there are 1 billion health-related searches on Google search every single day. That fact baffled me. It astounded me. 1 billion health-related searches every day. So we want to make sure that there's credible healthcare information out there when people are searching. And we're partnering with organizations like Kaiser Family Foundation and other authoritative health sources to boost the quality of information that's on Google search, that's on YouTube. YouTube's also used very much to answer health-related questions. I know I do that myself. And also we're introducing new features that make it easier for people to use the technologies they're familiar with. So within Google search, we've embedded appointment availability. We enable people to find in-network care right in their search result. And also we are trying to make it easier to navigate US government programs like Medicaid, which, disproportionately, certain populations are relying on.
And finally, as you rightly point out, so much on our phones. I mean, we live on our phones, so much information. When it comes to your world of healthcare and technology, we have seen an explosion of change really in the last 20 to 25 years. We've lived through all of this. And I'm curious just to get your thoughts about what we will see in the next 10 years, especially with Google Cloud and the partners that you're working with.
Yeah, I think one thing that we learned from the pandemic is collaboration is key. So we saw pharmaceutical organizations, research institutions, governments, countries really coming together to develop these vaccines to save people's lives. And I think that really showed us that we can accelerate innovation, particularly in the technology space, if we all partner together. So that's one of the things that I hope we continue moving forward, is just greater collaboration across the healthcare ecosystem and even outside with technology companies and government, et cetera. I also think, though, and one of the things we're trying to drive is more adoption of these emerging technologies, because we know that things like AI can lead to more earlier detection and prevention of diseases. It can help expand access to care where maybe there are shortages of doctors. But there are barriers to that adoption of these emerging technologies. So that's something that we're thinking about a lot about, which is how do we ensure there's data interoperability so the data is useful for organizations? How do we make sure that people can get trained up and they can, partner with technology companies to upskill their internal organization's capabilities? So those are a lot of the things that I think are going to be needed in order for us to really realize the potential of these great technologies.
And bottom line, saving lives and allowing Americans to live longer.
100%.
Lisa Sue Lynch is joining us from Seattle, Washington. Thank you for the work that you do, because your success clearly is our success. We appreciate your insights and your information. Good luck.
Thank you.
And we're keeping track of your tweets. You can do so at the Hill Events, and the hashtag is the Hill Health. As we said at the top of the program, whether it's semiconductor chips for medical technology to the much needed medications, modern medicine is reliant on an often complex and global supply chain issues. We certainly learned that during COVID-19, as you heard in our conversation just a moment ago, and during the pandemic. The recent shortage of medication like Adderall have put the supply chain issues consistently in the headlines. And so now we will have a discussion on how to innovate within our medical supply chains in order to reduce the disruptions and the resulting supply shortages. Here to shed some light on all of that are my two panelists. Dr. Pinar Keskanojak is the chair and professor of the Medical of Industrial and Systems Engineering at Georgia Tech, an impressive title. Thank you very much for being with us. She is also the co-founder and director of the Center for Health and Humanitarian Systems, where she advances science and evidence-based approaches to improve healthcare operations, including supply chain management, which will be my first question. And Mo Benham, who's a partner at McKinsey & Company. Mo leads McKinsey's medical products operations, working globally. He brings more than a decade and a half of experience with clients in the medical device and life science industries, consulting on issues including supply chain, procurement, and manufacturing. To both of you, thank you very much for being with us. Dr. Keskanojak, I want to begin with you because we've been talking about COVID-19 and really what we've learned about the supply chain and issues involving the medical supply chain as a result of this pandemic over the last 2.5 years.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us here. So medical supply chains, like many others, have a lot of entities ranging all the way from raw material suppliers to manufacturers, distributors, and retailers or clinics and hospitals that basically bring these products and services to us, to people. So they have some unique characteristics. They tend to be more global and complex. In some cases, they have less flexibility than some other suppliers. For example, we might have, than other supply chains, for example, we might have fewer players. Which means that if there is one area of the supply chain that gets disrupted, that might create significant cascading impacts across the entire supply chain. They also tend to be a little bit less flexible in terms of their processes. So they unfortunately embody many of the characteristics that we do not want to have in responsive, flexible supply chains. So that's partly why we have seen a lot of issues, especially during COVID, with medical, pharmaceutical supply chains and shortages across many products.
And Mo Benham, you're really on the front lines of all of this. So I'm curious, what do healthcare companies need to take into account when they are looking at the supply chain? And we talked about Adderall, one of the medicines that has been disrupted because of some of the issues we're talking about today.
Thank you, Steve. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to extend sincere appreciation and thank you to healthcare professionals and others who were involved in caring and protecting our families during COVID-19. We remember that they put their lives first to protect our society. Now, back to your question. As Pinar mentioned, the medical and medtech and med devices supply chain is a complex ecosystem. And that complex ecosystem gets unstable due to internal and external forces. Now, what companies have done to solve these issues range from short-term tactical initiatives to a longer-term one. In the short term, the biggest improvement that we've seen is establishing end-to-end forward-looking supply chain visibility. And when we say end-to-end, it's from raw material to delivery to the customers. Number two, looking at tactical midterm supply chain planning, which was mostly historically used to use historical demand, and now it's getting more towards real-time monitoring of the need and hence responding properly. And last but not least, establishing and using digital tools such as digital twin to do scenario planning for disruptions. In a midterm, they are looking to broader partnership with players outside their own four walls, i.e. suppliers and distributors, to ensure that they can work with each other to deliver those products to the patients and care for the patients. They are also looking at changes within their own processes to be more agile. An example here is quality management systems, where in medtech, if you want to change supplier to another supplier or a part to another supplier, you need to go through this system to document the changes and show validity of a new product being used or new parts being used. So creating more agile quality management system is another action that they are taking. And obviously in the longer term, looking at optimizing their supply chain and supply chain nodes within the regions to ensure that stability, and looking at the product designs and manufacturing processes are what they are considering.
Dr. Kesinocek, I love the analogy that you had in a recent interview for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and you compared the supply chain to race cars, and you basically say, quote, if you turn to the left or the right, they don't turn quickly. My question is why and what needs to be done to improve that?
Yeah, I think they are more like heavy ships, actually. You turn it and then it takes a while for it to shift direction. So I think Mo touched on some of these things. I would say one of the biggest things is visibility. Do we understand the supply chain end to end, not just thinking about the product and its manufacturer and maybe first-tier suppliers, but going beyond that? Where are the vulnerabilities? Sometimes it's also not sufficient to look at the supply chain from the perspective of one organization, but more from a higher level systems perspective. This is especially true for critical products from our nation's perspective. If there are few suppliers who are producing and supplying those products to us, chances are that there are some overlaps in their supply chains, which they may or may not be aware of. So taking this kind of higher level visibility or perspective and understanding the vulnerable areas in supply chains, I think is really key. So the other thing that's important is putting flexibility into supply chain as much as possible during what I would call normal times or sunny skies. Most supply chains are designed from the perspective of efficiency, which means we want to keep our costs low. And that usually relies on the assumption that we have a well understood stream of demand, well understood stream of supply. So we have kind of this like nice match between supply and demand, right? But when there's a disruption, the supply may just go down, or there might be a big surge in demand at some point. So these two may go out of whack. So if we have flexibility, for example, we are making two products and we could easily switch the volume between the two. If the demand goes up for one, we could adjust our production to meet the demand for that one. That would really help.
Well, thank you for bringing the props. We appreciate that. And let me begin or continue on that front, Mo Benham, because there has been a consistent supply chain shortage when it comes to semiconductors. We are seeing the growth of semiconductor plants, most notably in Ohio and upstate New York. But how did we get to this point? Why is there a shortage? And how do you fix that part of the problem? Because you can't talk about medical technology without talking about semiconductors.
Sure. Steve, it's important to recognize that when you make a medical device, the lifetime of those medical devices are relatively much younger than the lifetime of a single chip that we have in the market, i.e., I make an MRI that should last for 10 years, but by the time it's getting to the final years, I cannot source the components that are used to make that original device anymore because the technology in semiconductor have moved forward and those chips have not been produced. So that's number one. And number two is the fact that even if you can find a part or similar part, changing from an existing part to another part would require tons of effort. Now, you consider this context behind the industry and the fact that this semiconductor players had challenges in supplies and also they are the ones who are supplying to other industries, created this shortage situation moving forward. Now, in order to fix this, there are a few tactical things being done. As you said, nearshoring is one example where you are closer to your users, i.e. medical device companies, but also you can prioritize how this semiconductor chips gets used based on your nation's need. At the same time, there are some practices that can be done by the OEMs, medical device companies, to ensure the most effective and efficient use of this limited supplies, right? Number one, ensuring that when you are putting a system together, you have a full visibility to ensure all the other components are there and not end up having, a semi-finished product and then you realize that you already used one chip there versus you could have used it somewhere else. Number two, being effective to source from different suppliers and being able to make that switch easier and considering this when you're designing your equipment and devices early on. And last but not least, as Pinar just mentioned as well, being able to use the transparency in terms of overall demand in the market to work and get this limited supply and sign them properly.
Dr. Kesko-Nojak, I'm curious because you've been studying this both here in this country and around the world. There is a disparity between what's available in the U.S. and in developed countries versus more developing nations. And I wonder if you can address that disparity in what, with regard to medical technology, quite simply, what you think needs to be done.
I think one of the most important things is to have a portfolio of products to meet similar needs. So just take the example of vaccines. We might have vaccines at different levels of efficacy and different requirements in terms of transportation, storage, distribution. So this is important across multiple aspects. First of all, it's cost. Second, it's the ability of producing at large volumes. And third, the ability to distribute, especially last mile. A product that's a good fit for one environment may or may not be a good fit for another environment, for another subpopulation. So it's very important to have these different portfolios of products with complementary characteristics so that we can actually reach populations or subpopulations within our own country and also around the world. And I just want to highlight one more thing about the last mile real quick. That's where we see a lot of challenges. So we might be able to deliver a particular product, let's say, to a central depot in a state or in a depot in a country, but actually taking the product from there and distributing to the final users is often a big challenge.
But Mo Benem, I think you would agree that there is a direct connection between the supply chains, some of the breakdown in that supply chain, and the health disparities that we're seeing, even in this country, from more urban areas to rural communities.
I would agree with that. Steve and Spinar said the final delivery and the last mile delivery or last inch delivery matters a lot in this space.
And so let me address this to both of you, and Mo Benem, I'll begin with you. Are we ready for the next pandemic, the next health emergency, both in this country and globally?
Are we ready? I think we are in a much better place compared to where we were before COVID. That's one answer. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge that supply chain shocks are often impossible to predict, but happen very regularly. Let me share with you some numbers to demonstrate this. We looked at the events that have happened in the last 10 years. And it's important to recognize that the events that would disrupt the supply chain in medtech for 1 or 2 weeks actually happens almost in every 2 years. Events that can disrupt the supply chain for 1 to 2 months happens every 3 to 4 years. And in summary, right, every 10 years, medtech companies can use about 38% of 1 year EBITDA. So these things happen often. Now, I hope we won't have any more pandemic coming up anytime in near and longer term future, but we should get prepared by fixing the foundations, which we've done a good work, but still a long way to go. And number two, creating a better partnership to deliver supplies to our patients when and if needed.
And Dr. Kesikhanojak, the same question to you, the level of preparedness that we have in this country, are we ready?
We made some progress, but I think we still have a long ways to go. We really need to invest more into basic healthcare so that we can actually keep people healthy. Our healthcare system still operates with the mindset of sick care versus healthcare. We talk about patients, even though a person might be perfectly healthy and the goal should be to keep them healthy, but we refer to them as patients. I think there's still a lot of investment that needs to be done into prevention and also sharing credible information with people so that they can take the right actions if and when the next big health emergency might arise.
And Mo Benem, final question for you. Are there companies, are there industries that you point to that you want to shine a light on that are like, these are the places that will see significant improvement when it comes to the topics that we've been discussing here today?
I think in medtech, there are a few players that they have done a significant improvement in the last 2.5 years. What we see is much better use of digital technology and digital twins to do scenario-based analysis and understand the implications of the decisions in a much more granular way compared to before and use that information to make better decisions. And number two is much better improvement in terms of understanding and getting visibility to end-to-end supply chain. I think the last 2.5 years was a big push to these companies, and we've seen tons of improvement.
And Dr. Kesikhanojak, a final question for you, because as you well know, there has been a reluctance in this country during this pandemic for many Americans to get the vaccine. And we're seeing that now as we move into the winter months here in the U.S. How do we get beyond that? What is your advice based on your expertise and your research?
Yeah, I think, again, some of the things I mentioned before. Number one, better education and reliable information so we can actually prepare people ahead of time before an emergency happens. So we don't have to build the plane while flying it. And then number two, really focusing on the information, data collection, and turning it into useful information. For example, if we see low uptake rates regarding vaccination in a particular area, is it because of hesitancy? Is it because we don't have enough supply? Is it because we have the supply, but people don't know where to find it? So there could be a variety of reasons as to why we see low vaccination rates in a particular area. But often what we've seen, especially earlier in the pandemic, is that we did not know specifically why. So I think investing into some of those areas, starting with better education of individuals and the public, would help us go a long way.
And Mo Benham, do you want to pick up on that final point? Agree or disagree?
I definitely agree in terms of the education. I'm not an expert in vaccine and vaccine delivery, so I would reserve any comment on that.
To both of you, thank you. Dr. Keskanojak is the co-founder and the director of the Center for Health and Humanitarian Systems at Georgia Tech. Mo Benham, he's a partner at McKinsey & Company. Appreciate your time today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Back in 2016, as Vice President, Joe Biden oversaw what was the launch of the Cancer Moonshot Project. Now in 2022, President Biden announcing the reignition of this moonshot goal with the objective of cutting the cancer death rate in half over the next 25 years, as well as improving the lives of the patients and those survivors. My next guest can speak to the progress that we are making in this space and also the innovations to come. We want to welcome Dr. Ethan Dimitrievsky, who is the director of the Frederick National Laboratory for Cancer Research, and he's president of the Leidos Biomedical Research. Doctor, thank you very much for joining us today. And I want to begin with this Moonshot Project. How do we get there over the next 2.5 decades?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you so much for inviting me to take part today. I really appreciate the invitation. And the views that I'm going to express are my personal views as a cancer scientist and cancer doctor, not speaking on behalf of the National Cancer Institute or the Frederick National Laboratory. But let me put in perspective the question that you've asked. When President Kennedy put forth his famous address of the creation of the Apollo moonshot 60 years ago, it's important to recognize that we achieved those goals through public-private partnership. Just think for a moment, only 32 Apollo astronauts went to the moon. Only 12 of them walked on the lunar surface, but over 400,000 scientists, engineers, NASA, military, and staff from the public and private sectors worked together to get them to the moon and back safely. So over the course of my career, I've seen tremendous progress in tackling the cancer problem. Cancer is a scourge that affects nearly every family. Each of us knows someone who has had a cancer diagnosis. And during the last few decades, indeed, when the cancer incidence peaked in 1991 until 2019, the American Cancer Society has reported a 32% decline in that mortality rate. So progress has already been made. In my own career, I've seen stunning progress as a cancer doctor. Indeed, just think over the last few years, we've added a new arm to the armamentarium of tackling the cancer problem, immunotherapy that's been in the news so much. So part of the answer to your question is by putting an emphasis on public-private partnerships. We need not look beyond the example that you've already spoken about with the earlier panel members of the COVID response, that the fastest a vaccine was created before the recent vaccines for COVID occurred over 4 years of time invested, but in less than a year, we were able to bring to market and to patients new vaccines. And this was an example of public-private partnerships where public funds were used to accelerate science and move advances from the bench to the bedside to help patients. So that is an example that I'd like to cite.
I just want to point out Dr. Dimitrievsky has been on the cutting edge of cancer research, including genetic and gene therapy for leukemia. You have been honored for your work, and so we thank you for your expertise on this. Is the goal, though, realistic? 25 years?
Well, if you look, Steve, at the examples I just cited, that from 1991 to 2019, a 32% reduction in cancer death rate. That was before we had the advances that basic science has brought to the fore. New ways of combating cancer, like immunotherapy, but other ways. One of the most daunting and difficult cancer problems have been to try to treat RAS oncoprotein, RAS-causing protein, that is linked to several very, very difficult and challenging cancers to treat. An example is pancreatic cancer, where 95% of pancreatic cancer patients have mutations, alterations of the RAS cancer-causing protein called an oncoprotein, but about a third of lung and a third of colon cancers harbor these mutations. And for 40 years, we've known about these mutations, but just the year before last was the very first drug that successfully targeted a subset of the RAS causing cancers in lung cancer. So there's been tremendous progress that was made possible through decades of basic science investment that the public funds have used. And this has unleashed opportunities that we didn't have before. And that's why I have hope for the future as a cancer doctor, that I and we will be able to bring new measures to patients who really need innovation in the cancer clinic.
But doctor, let me ask you about that issue of treatment, because as you rightly point out, every one of us, either through family or friends, have known somebody dealing with cancer. For those who undergo the treatment and are lucky enough to survive, do you envision that the treatment in the future will be less painful, less difficult for those patients?
That is the hope, but there's also reality that we can point to, Steve. And I'll give you an example from my own scientific experience. I was involved in a discovery early in my career of a rare but lethal leukemia called acute promyelocytic leukemia, where very harsh measures were used to treat these leukemia sufferers. And even with these very toxic therapies, chemotherapy, sadly only about a quarter of patients were cured. And my team and others brought to the clinic an FDA-approved treatment for this type of leukemia that was an oral therapy, didn't require IV therapy. And this oral therapy, combined with other measures like the drug arsenic trioxide, has meant that we have an oral regimen, much less toxic and highly effective for so-called good risk acute promyelocytic leukemia patients, and well over 90% of these patients are cured now with an oral therapy, much less toxic, well tolerated, and I think there'll be many examples of this in the future. That would be one that I would cite.
And of course, you know the question that I'm sure you get often and I hear so often, do you envision at some point we would have a vaccine that would prevent cancer?
Many of us have hoped that there will be ways for us to have less invasive, less toxic measures that could control cancers and even prevent them. And this is an area of active research throughout the country, especially with the promise of immunotherapy. And so I hold high regard the scientists who are working in this field, and suspect over time we will see progress. But it would be very hard for anyone to predict when that day will come.
And based on your work, and we certainly know the numbers speak for themselves, if you don't smoke, your chances of getting cancer are reduced significantly. If you could just explain what you've been doing on the front lines to make sure that you put in these programs that save many lives.
You've cited something very important for the viewers of this panel to know, and that is the health benefits that will accrue from all of us who might be smoking to stop smoking. And that includes the reduction of cancer risk, but also a reduction of risk of respiratory illnesses like chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases and heart disease. So the benefits of not smoking accrue not only in reducing risk of cancer, but the risk of cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. The hope is that we'll have other interventions that will prevent cancers from forming in the first place, or detecting it at such an early stage that the treatments will be less harsh and less difficult for cancer sufferers to tolerate. But the statistics that I gave you, Steve, just a few minutes ago about the reduction of cancer mortality can be attributed, at least in part, to the fact that Americans are smoking less, exposing their family to less tobacco carcinogens as well as themselves. And so I would urge all viewers to know this fact.
Dr. Dimitrovsky, if you land at Boston's Logan Airport, you will see a mural that says, you like your smartphone, you can thank President Kennedy and the moon program, because that public-private partnership that led to the technology that we're now using 60 years later and really don't think anything of it. So I use that example to ask you about the private partnership with the federal government when it comes to cancer research, whether it's vaccines, treatment, and or cures.
I'll give you an example that I'm familiar with in the work that we do at the Frederick National Laboratory. And keep in mind that we are a federally funded research and development center. We use public funds to serve the public interest. And we have many examples of public-private partnership that really relate to your question. I'll give you one example. In a collaboration between another national lab, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, with the University of California, with the biopharmaceutical maker GSK, and the Frederick National Laboratory, and of course, the National Cancer Institute. We have come together using the powerful exascale computing capability of the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory to tackle a very difficult problem in cancer drug development. It takes upwards of 12 years or longer to bring an idea from the lab into the clinic for ultimate FDA approval. Half of that time is spent in what's called preclinical drug discovery, testing whether a drug gets to the target in a cancer cell and has the desired effect, moving that promising target into a small molecule or an antibody that would inactivate or alter the target in the desired way, test in animals, and ultimately show that it has the right pharmacologic properties well before any patient is treated. This time, 6 years or more, has to be reduced so we can get the latest innovation to patients as quick as we can. And so this collaborative team is using artificial intelligence, machine learning, that you've already talked about today, to reduce that time by developing algorithms that will predict whether a promising compound could be made into a drug, whether it will have drug-like properties so that it can be fashioned into the right formulation that can be given to a patient with the right half-life, reduced toxicity. And the hope is to use these powerful tools of artificial intelligence to shorten that time. That's but one example of a public-private partnership that has a clinical endpoint that, if successful, it will shorten the time of drug discovery. And because public funds are used, anything that's learned is shared with other scientists nationally as soon as we can.
And of course, obviously, preventative care saves so much more than being hospitalized. That goes without question. It is so apparent as we have this conversation with you today that you have a lot of enthusiasm about where we're going, the cutting edge in terms of AI and medical technology and research. I'm wondering, what excites you the most? What are you most hopeful about moving forward?
And if you could tell me, you mean in the clinical realm or the scientific realm?
In the terms of the research that you're doing right now on the front lines of biomedicine.
I think that now that we know the intricacies of what makes a cancer form, and as I said before, decades of scientific discoveries have given us newfound insights into how we can alter the cancer microenvironment, the cancer cell itself, its ability to be eradicated by new and powerful immunologic measures. I think we're standing ready to apply what's been learned in multiple areas, Steve, that have the promise of changing the course, the clinical course of patient care. And I have seen progress throughout my career, but it seems to me that that progress is now accelerating.
So if we were having this conversation in, say, perhaps 2045 or 2050, what do you think we'll be talking about?
I think we'll be talking about more specific therapies that target the very cause of what makes a cell become malignant, using less toxic, better tolerated, and even more effective therapies, because we will be targeting the root cause of what drives a cancer to form.
Dr. Ethan Dimitrovsky, he is the director of the Frederick National Laboratory for Cancer Research. Doctor, thank you very much for joining me today. We appreciate all that you're doing, and keep up the great work. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
And joining me now to continue our discussion on cancer initiatives and lay out her strategic plan is the White House Cancer Moonshot Coordinator, Dr. Danielle Carnival. Dr. Carnival, welcome to this conversation. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Good to be here.
So let's talk very specifically about the goals that the president put in place over the next 25 years. What are they?
Yeah, so President Biden and the First Lady earlier this year reignited the Cancer Moonshot that they started in 2016 and set out bold new goals to decrease the death rate from cancer by at least 50%, over the next 25 years, and to improve the experience and the support for patients, caregivers, family through living with and surviving cancer.
As we've been talking about, every American has been touched by cancer one way or the other. Certainly the president with the loss of his son, Beau Biden, to brain cancer, making this a very personal issue for the president and the First Lady. But I'm curious if during the COVID-19 pandemic, did that in any way slow down the cancer research that is going on, and is it now the right time to kind of, as you say, reignite the research and initiatives that we're trying to put into place?
Well, it's definitely time to double down and reignite the progress that we've seen over the last 25 years in over the last 2 decades in decreasing the death rate from cancer by 25%. Really gives us a map of how to accelerate that and make a difference for millions of Americans going forward. The COVID-19 pandemic did impact research outside of the work that was being done to combat and get in hand the pandemic, but it quickly bounced back. Funding for the National Cancer Institute, which is the primary funder of cancer research, was always there, always moving forward, and making an impact on reaching these goals and on really driving innovation and new ways to prevent, detect, and treat cancer.
How do you make sure that there are no silos when it comes to the research, that that's broken down and that all parties, whether it's public-private partnerships, medical institutions, schools and hospitals, are collaborating when they find new discoveries, new research, new therapeutics?
A couple of things. One, we're starting with the federal government. So part of the answer to how we're going to accomplish the president's vision for the reignited Cancer Moonshot is let's bring all parts of government together and make sure that we're not creating silos between the great research that happens at the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs, along with what happens at Health and Human Services, Department of Energy, like we just heard from, and many others. So we started by getting our house in order. There's also policy decisions that we can make. that helps to incentivize and really enable collaboration. One example is earlier this year, the administration put out a new rule where research that is funded by federal taxpayer dollars, when those publications come out, they need to be freely available to everyone. You don't need a subscription, you don't need to pay, you don't need to be an expert. This is taxpayer funded research. This started with cancer in 2016 and now applies across the federal government to federally funded research, a really important step. But the other thing is calling on people's to people's best interests. You heard a little bit from the doctor on how much we're understanding about cancers and how specific some of these cancers are. That means that one physician will not see enough of them to make progress alone. So the science is really driving collaboration in new ways as we understand more about this disease.
As you know, we're in the middle of a midterm election campaign, and one of the issues that continues to come up, the disparities between more urban areas that have access to the right type of health care and rural areas. When it comes to cancer, can you address that disparity? Are there disparities, and are they being addressed?
There are a number of disparities in access to early detection, in access to prevention, and in access to clinical trials and excellent care. That yes, are zip code based in some cases, are race or gender or ethnicity based in other cases. And so a real focus of the Cancer Moonshot is we need to drive innovation to find new ways, additional ways to prevent, detect, and treat cancer to reach our goals. But we're going to get a lot of the way towards our goal by making sure that more Americans have access to the great tools we already have and those we develop along the way.
Is there a price tag for all of this over the next 20 to 25 years?
I think to start, there has been historically very strong bipartisan support for biomedical research and specifically the National Cancer Institute and the work on cancer. We expect that to continue to go forward. I think what we're looking to do is say, we want to bring the same level of innovation that applies to cancer research to how we think about prevention, to how we think about making sure healthcare reaches more people, to how we think about making sure that early detection reaches more people. So we hope and expect to see more investment in those areas going forward.
As I mentioned, this is personal when you talk to the president. You've certainly talked to the president and First Lady. What are his marching orders to you, and how does he convey what he went through, as so many other millions of Americans have gone through over so many years?
Yeah, I mean, the priority from the president, the First Lady, the Vice President, most of the cabinet was shown at the launch event or the reignition event in February. They were all there. They are all showing up to the cancer cabinet meetings and making sure we're driving this forward. So it's not just the president and first lady's personal experience, it's all of ours that is really driving this work. But I think an important thing to note is he has talked publicly about some of the things they saw going through their own personal experience with their son, and the First Lady all the way back to the 1990s when she had a number of friends diagnosed with breast cancer at the same time. They, from that experience, have kind of exposure to what some of the issues are, and that drove how we talked about breaking down silos, making sure patients and families are really in the driver's seat and have access to their medical information so that they can make the best decisions, that clinical trials, which are really the leading edge, especially in some cancers where standard of care isn't making the difference we want it to, are available to more people. They firsthand saw some of these issues, and that kind of started our agenda. And then we did a lot of listening to make sure that the priorities that we were setting really matched what mattered to people directly impacted by this disease today.
I'm curious, in our remaining few minutes, if you can point to areas that you are most encouraged about. You're a neuroscientist, where you think we're going to make the biggest progress and when.
Yeah, I think the exciting thing is we have so many more tools today than we had even a couple of decades ago. We have a vaccine. You asked about vaccines. We have a vaccine that prevents the cause of up to 7 types of cancer in the HPV vaccine. If we had widespread uptake of that vaccine, we could eliminate cervical cancer. We could take an entire cancer pretty much off the map. That's exciting to me. We can develop more less invasive tools for detecting cancer early that can reach more Americans and take down some of the barriers to people who can't take a day off and get that colonoscopy, or don't have a ride to get there, or are afraid that it'll be too expensive for them, which shouldn't be, because the Affordable Care Act really took on preventative and early screening, and that should be covered for recommended screenings for people. But I think what we focus on, yes, I'm a neuroscientist and the science is really exciting, but how do we translate that faster and in an more impactful way to changing people's lives, to improving outcomes, to making sure they get that cancer detected earlier, so that we have more tools while we're really pushing the boundaries of these precision medicine directed treatments that the doctor talked about, that are less harmful and get people back to their lives even faster. Let me say one thing. I know that I'm painting a very positive picture. We know that the impact of cancer is still devastating on 1.8 million families across the country every year. So we don't have enough, but we are excited about the progress that's been made and are laser focused on making sure that reaches more people.
Also devastating is ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. You've been involved in that as well. And I'm wondering, different situation, but the same concept when it comes to research and development and potentially cures. What did you learn from your work there? How do you apply it at the White House today?
A couple things. One, I've dealt with people facing illnesses. I've lost a parent to cancer and other members of my family. I thought I really had an understanding of what it meant to stand up and fight for them and be an advocate for them. But the ALS community is a whole different story. They've impacted me in ways that I will never be the same in how I want to live my life, but also how I approach barriers that we could remove, that we could make progress against, that will make a difference. There's just incredible neuroscience work being done. A drug just got approved for ALS just about a couple weeks or a month ago. I just hope for the ALS community that that's a crack in the wall and really shows that this is possible, and that we can do something for the tens of thousands of people facing that diagnosis.
So you have technology companies, you have research hospitals, you have NIH. Your job is to coordinate all of this. How do you do that? How does it all come together? What is your job specifically?
Yeah, I mean, you described it well. We worked with as many people in the community, from researchers, technology companies, biopharmaceutical companies, academic institutions, patients, caregivers, survivors, public health officials, really everyone that touches this disease, and says, if this is our North Star, the president wants to accomplish these two goals of cutting the cancer death rate and improving the experience, what do we need to do in your opinion, to get there? And so the Cancer Cabinet has broken that down into 5 areas of: close the screening gap, understand and address toxic and environmental exposures, drive innovation, decrease the impact of preventable cancers, and support the patient and family. And so that's really our shared agenda for everyone across the country, not just across the government, to say, how can I step up and be a part of it? We have a website, whitehouse.gov/cancer-moonshot, where people can share their ideas, their stories. We know how much that impacts kind of the compelling stories of struggle and hopefully triumph, impact people paying attention to these issues. But we also have a section where people can share new actions and new collaborations that they want to contribute as part of this mission, as part of this movement that is the Cancer Moonshot. And so we are really excited to see those ideas and to have everyone be a part of accomplishing this and making progress for people all across the country.
And as you pointed out earlier, this is a bipartisan issue with support from Democrats, Republicans, certainly from the White House and from Congress. But as you measure the metrics moving forward, what will you specifically be looking for?
Yeah, I said it briefly earlier, but the quantifiable goal that we have to stay on track to decrease the death rate from cancer by at least 50% over the next 25 years, year over year, we're going to see how we're doing against that. And I think that is going to be a telling sign as to the progress we're making. And what I'm excited about as part of that is we're going to be able to adjust our strategy. We have data-driven efforts and design as to how we think we're going to reach that goal. A lot of it's in prevention and early detection. A lot of it is decreasing inequities, in addition to new tools we couldn't even imagine today. But we're going to have to keep checking back in and making sure that the balance of how we're focusing on that is really making a difference. And you talked about the bipartisan nature. The 21st Century Cures Act in 2016 was a robustly bipartisan measure that invested $1.8 billion additional dollars in the cancer moonshot in this fight. The bipartisan infrastructure law isn't only building new roads and bridges, but it's cleaning up water pipes and toxic sites, Superfund sites that'll make a difference in prevention. The Inflation Reduction Act is capping out-of-pocket costs for seniors on Medicare that are facing cancer and other diseases. So there's a lot of congressional action that's a part of this, most of it hugely bipartisan. So we're excited to see that keep going forward.
And Dr. Carnival, I just want to begin on a personal, because you indicated your own situation, losing a parent to cancer. What did you learn about the disease as a daughter?
Yeah, so I unfortunately lost my stepmother to the same disease that Bo faced, glioblastoma. And so I wasn't only kind of working in policy at the time, but I was a neuroscientist. And so I think it really puts you in the situation of any American facing that diagnosis for yourself or your family. I had a lot of knowledge on the brain and things related to that disease, but that all kind of gets wiped away, and you're just a kid trying to fight for the best outcomes for your parent. And so I think what I hope that translates to is not just in me, but in everyone from the federal government side working on this, that we can't understand anyone's individual specific situation, but we can relate to that experience because so many of us, nearly all of us, have gone through it ourselves.
And Dr. Carnival, you are confident we'll get there in the next 25 years?
I am. We do have to accelerate from basically double the rate of progress that we saw over the last 2 decades. But because we've really opened the aperture and said innovation in research is a huge part of this, but innovation in really how we care for people, how we prevent cancer, how we detect it early is a part of it as well. And that's really going to accelerate our progress.
Joining us from the White House as the Cancer Moonshot Coordinator, Dr. Danielle Carnival, thank you very much. We appreciate your time on a busy day. Thanks for adding your perspective to this very important conversation.
Thank you so much for having me and for the focus and attention on this.
And as we know far too well, routine doctor's visits are associated with better healthcare outcomes, and they're also a cornerstone of our preventative health. So how might we incentivize and promote preventative health and encourage early diagnosis? We'll spend the next portion of our program taking a deeper dive into the issue of preventative health care and innovations in patient care as well as access. And joining me to kick off that part of the discussion is Dr. Dora Hughes. She is the Chief Medical Officer at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Let me begin with COVID-19 and really get your overall sense of how that has changed or impacted preventative care for so many Americans.
I would answer that in at least 2 ways. I'm sure there's more, but first, it really helped to shine a light on prevention. I think even as much as we talk about prevention and health promotion and the activities that are needed, still we take it for granted. Too many Americans still are not going to get the recommended preventive care. And so in terms of the pandemic, we were reminded again, that it's not just the COVID vaccination, which in and of itself was life-saving, but it was a reminder about all the other immunizations that historically and currently have really enabled Americans to live longer, live healthier, live more productive lives. And so I think that the COVID pandemic, again, just reminded all of us of the importance of prevention. But on a second level, it also reminded us again about the disparities in the system that too many Americans don't have the access they need to preventive care, and that may be because they don't have insurance coverage, or their insurance coverage is not robust enough, or it may be more practically that they don't live in an area where there's enough providers who can provide the preventive care. Maybe they have issues with transportation. And we know that a number of populations are more likely to have these barriers to getting preventive care. Certain racial and ethnic groups, certain low groups that don't have a high enough income in certain rural areas, those with disabilities. We can go on, but there's a number of populations that especially have trouble accessing the needed care. And between the two, reminder of the importance of prevention and understanding that some groups especially have barriers trying to access preventive care, that has really helped to influence our work at CMS broadly, and certainly at the CMS Innovation Center where I work.
Well, let me follow up on that point, because it is obvious preventative care is a lot cheaper than going to the hospital. So often, so many Americans use the ER as their primary care physician. How do we get to the point where we are reaching those who need it the most, who need that preventative care?
I'll give you one example of what we found in one of our models. To your point, where there is over-reliance on the emergency department instead of going to see the primary care provider. In this case, it was at a hospital in Reading, Pennsylvania, and our colleagues there locally shared a story of a family, a young mother. She had a child who was 5, who on his 17th visit to the emergency department, the 17th visit, for non-emergent reasons, the staff in the hospital screened the family for social needs. And in this case, they found that the family was struggling with mold in the housing. They didn't have heat. They were relying upon the stove for heat. They had difficulties with transportation. All of these different factors together made their personal situation very difficult, made it very difficult for them to go in and see their primary care provider. And long term was having an impact on their health and healthcare utilization. Long story short, I won't go into it, but by one of our initiatives, one of our models, the Accountable Health Communities model, the staff in the emergency room linked the family up with social services. Within a relatively short period of time, they were able to get their housing situation squared away. They were able to get legal help to help with the landlord. They were able to get transportation needs addressed. All of that not only drove down how often they had to show up in the emergency room for non-emergent reasons, but it also improved their health outcomes for the child and for the mother. So we're pretty excited about being very deliberate and trying to integrate clinical interventions with community health interventions so that we know that our beneficiaries are receiving holistic care that in the end will pay off both in terms of their health, but also the financial cost to the healthcare system.
Dr. Hughes, as we heard earlier from Dr. Stephen McMillan, Hologic, which is our sponsor of this, talking about the use of technology and really how that can break through in so many different areas to get to the patients to deal with some of this preventative health care. So I'm wondering if you can address that issue, how you think technology more broadly will impact healthcare moving forward.
That's such an excellent question, and we're excited about, again, the work that we're supporting across CMS, but certainly through the Innovation Center. And I think it helps to piggyback on your last question about what did we learn during COVID? And one, that healthcare providers across the whole range of providers were able to support telehealth regardless of the clinical setting, and that the patients were able to take full advantage of telehealth. And across the spectrum, we always have this notion that it's younger, more educated Americans, but we saw even for our elderly, our senior beneficiaries and others, that they too were able to tap into telehealth. And that really helped to expand access to providers. They were able to get healthcare advice and guidance on a more timely basis. They were able to make their appointments. They were able to receive education more easily, more guidance from the doctors, nurses, and others. So we really think that again helps to underscore the importance of telehealth as one technology, and in newer areas. I mean, certainly for primary care, internal medicine, but also for behavioral health. And we know across the nation there's a shortage of mental health and behavioral health providers. Technology through telehealth was critically important in really expanding access to a number of different populations, particularly those in rural areas, as one example. So we think that within the context of providing greater access to providers, who in many areas are in short supply, there's no better example of how technology can help to improve health and healthcare.
You have been on the front lines of public health, your work now at CMS, but also your nonprofit work at the Milken Institute at George Washington University here in Washington, D.C. I'm wondering, based on your expertise, is there a way to incentivize access to public health?
Yes, and that is, to your point, an area of intense focus here at the CMS Innovation Center. We're approaching it in 3 different ways. The first is through some of our work, we are looking directly at different preventive services and how can we do more. As one example, through our Million Hearts initiative, is there a way that doctors, that we can facilitate the provision of cardiovascular health screening, information, preventive care through our research? How can we help doctors provide this care? We're doing the same through our model that was focusing on the diabetes prevention program. It's still astounding to so many to understand that if you lose between 5 and 10% of your weight, you can drive down the risk of developing type 2 adult onset diabetes by, in some cases, more than 50%. And so how do we scale up these interventions? That's our charge. Like it's one thing to be able to show this in a research lab or to show these in different pockets of and in many communities across the nation, but how do we scale it up so all of us who may be at risk of diabetes in this example can take full advantage? And so at the center, we are focusing on specific conditions, certain disease areas where we know that preventive care will make a difference. But we're also thinking about who's most likely to provide preventive care. In that case, it's primary care physicians. We have substantially invested in improving primary care. We know that it's a tough job to be a primary care provider. I know that I was one of them. And so how can we make the payment more flexible? What are the technologies and tools and learning supports that we can provide? Is there additional payment, actually, monthly payments that can help to enhance the care? So that's another area. And the third and final area I mentioned just very briefly, again, we are laser focused on addressing the social needs of our patients, working very closely with our colleagues in public health, our colleagues in the social services sector, thinking through how can all of us working together? What are the synergies that in the end can enable greater access to preventive care for our beneficiaries?
Let me conclude with another issue that we've been talking about as the president is encouraging all Americans to get the COVID booster shot, to get the flu vaccine. As you well know, there are a lot of questions, a lot of concerns, and some speculation that vaccines don't work or can provide some side effects that could be dangerous to the individual. Your message to those on the fence deciding whether or not to get the vaccines, whether it's for the flu or the COVID booster, your message is what?
My very simple message would be sign up, go get your shot. But I would also say for those that have concerns, in the CMS Center, we have a considerable, extraordinary amounts of data on our beneficiaries who, particularly those that were in nursing home settings and other institutional settings, and those that are participating in our Medicare program, those that are Medicaid. We are able to see firsthand through these data analyses, just again, the life-saving effect of the vaccinations. Those that received the shots, how they have fared compared to those that have not. It's just very, very compelling. I would also have to also say, here at CMS, we work very closely with our colleagues in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as in the Food and Drug Administration, a number of other agencies, where we're relying on their relationships very closely with the communities on the ground, with the community-based organizations, the faith-based institutions, those in schools, those that are trusted messengers and could provide even more assurance and confidence than I am as a federal official here in Washington, D.C. We understand that these partnerships with trusted messengers will just be critically important, even as we are facing the next wave of COVID and flu and other illnesses this winter.
So, Dr. Hughes, in our final minute, in a sentence or two, the mission statement of the CMS Innovation Center is what?
The mission of the CMS Innovation Center is to test innovative care delivery and payment models that can help us achieve our goal of an equitable health system that's providing high quality, affordable, and person-centered care to every American.
Dr. Dora Hughes, she is the Chief Medical Officer at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. Thanks so much for being with us here today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us. My next guest is Dr. Karina Davidston, Director of the Institute of Health System Science at the Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research. That, by the way, is the research arm of Northwell Health, which is part of New York State's largest healthcare provider. She also recently served as the chair of the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force. Dr. Davidston, welcome to the conversation. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
I want to begin with a very basic question, and I think one that we can all relate to. It is so hard to convince some people to get those medical checkups, to get those screenings, especially post-COVID-19. Why?
I think that's a great question to start with. I think everyone's exhausted, everyone's burnt out, everyone's stressed, everyone's isolated, and the priority list often deals with crises. And prevention is that ounce that just takes a little movement, a little care by a patient with their primary care provider that can lead to avoiding so much pain, disease later on in life. And so we need to help everyone get back into their good habits, just like brushing teeth. You need to go once a year. Look at the evidence-based guidelines for what prevention screenings will benefit you, and make sure that you set those up. As your previous speaker said, those can now be accomplished by telehealth. Sometimes they can be done electronically. Sometimes you can go to your pharmacy and they can provide some of the screenings. So we've really worked hard to make sure that this is more accessible to more Americans.
And so as you have said so often, that is the cornerstone of keeping Americans healthy. Telehealth does help. It is important. But does it replace that personal visit with a physician where you can talk one-on-one confidentially about any issues you may be having and getting that one-on-one personal health evaluation?
I think that's a very personal question for each patient, Steve. Each patient has to weigh if they're not going to do it, because finding childcare, leaving their job, transport are the barriers that they have, the structural barriers that they have to getting to a health appointment, and getting on a phone or getting on a laptop with a clinician late at night or on a weekend is the way they can do it. They may choose that a better way. The gold standard of having precious time in person, as we know for a lot of Americans, just isn't attainable right now. But where it's attainable, that's certainly what we recommend.
So when it comes to these issues of preventative health, I'm curious, where were we in early 2020 before COVID-19, and where are we now in late 2022?
I don't know all of the national trends. I only know about some screening practices. I think we've seen overall that there were many Americans who were frankly in the habit of going and seeing their primary care provider, whoever that was, once a year to ensure that they had the cancer screenings and the other prevention services that they needed. COVID disrupted that and people got out of the habit. So we saw necessarily far fewer people did that during the acute phases of the pandemic waves, and many people have not yet gotten back on track with it. And that's going to have consequences for the chronic diseases and acute diseases that could have been prevented by those visits. So we're encouraging everyone, if you're behind on your visits, make one in whatever way you, with your lifestyle and your family situation, can manage to have one, whether that's over a computer, online, by telephone, or in person.
My next question, based on your work on the task force, is a definition: personalized trials. You're an expert. What are they?
So thank you for that question. And I'm very excited to talk to people about personalized trials. This is actually part of my research at Northwell Health and the Feinstein Institutes. It's a way of working with a patient to find the least amount of treatment for the most benefit with the fewest side effects. We have many, many evidence-based treatments for which we don't have one single universal cure. So high blood pressure is a great example. There are many great, inexpensive, safe medications that work to manage blood pressure, but not every single person has the same response to each medication. And so if you're going to be on a medication your whole life, you want to be on the one that changes your blood pressure the most and, say, doesn't give you headaches or a dry mouth. And so personalized trials expose you systematically to the evidence-based treatments that exist so that you have results about which one works for you.
And I'm curious, is that treatment different if you're a man or a woman, or if you're young or old, or if you're Caucasian versus African American or Hispanic? Are there differences in terms of your race and gender?
One of the things that we found so powerful about this particular approach to precision therapeutics, finding the right treatment for the right person, is it's just asking the question, what works for you? So whether you're African American, whether you're older, whether you have a lot of comorbidities, whether you have none, we're saying, if we add this treatment to what's going on with you right now, do we overall help you, or did we not make things better?
So based on that, is there enough diversity in the research community to address some of these issues? Are you finding that there may be a disparity because you don't have enough researchers that can identify or be an expert in some of these matters?
You've put your finger on one of the nationwide gaps we have. We do not have sufficient representation in our scientific workforce. We do not have sufficient representation and input, frankly, from our diverse community members. And without that, we sometimes ask the wrong questions and we have the wrong priorities and we don't get the answers for all Americans. And so I think there are a number of people at all levels of policy, governmental agencies, individual healthcare systems, medical schools, graduate schools working to try and remedy that so we can ensure that we have inclusive research that answers the questions that are most important to everyone here.
And you have a name for this. It's called the MAVEN Project. So how do we get there over the next 10 to 15 years?
We have a number of solutions that people are trying. We're trying one, we're doing as an experiment. We've asked those really successful, underrepresented and women scientists to engage in an experiment with us where we help them learn the tools and network with different people to get to a position where they have more influence over the type of science that is conducted. These scientists have graciously agreed to be in a study themselves, so half are randomized to the intervention and half are not. And in 5 years, we'll see if we've had a more powerful, sustainable influence on the diversity of the research that's conducted by those who receive the intervention.
I asked this question earlier.
Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
I'm just going to say we all have to try many things at different levels to understand better how we can include everyone in the research enterprise.
I was just going to say, I asked this question earlier, but I'd like to ask it to you, Dr. Davidson. What excites you the most? What are you most encouraged about in the research that you're doing in the areas that we're talking about here today?
I think the overall takeaway message I'd love your audience to hear is prevention works. You know, answering a simple questionnaire, getting a simple blood draw, doing very, very small things can save lives. That's what's most exciting to me. When we can get to patients earlier at milder, just starts of disease, we have evidence-based ways of preventing them from developing that disease. And that's what this entire nation needs to head towards. Let's stop people from having the chronic conditions and problems that so many suffer with for so long by just offering that ounce of evidence-based prevention early.
And yet, that is often so very difficult.
It is. Many structural barriers on the payment and physician and primary care provider side, and many barriers on the patient side. And we together have to work on implementing all of those barriers, so it's an easy thing for everyone to engage in.
Dr. Karina Davidson, thank you for your work on the Preventative Task Force and your work on these issues. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Steve. Great being with you.
And of course, this type of preventative care requires physicians and medical providers. Joining me now to talk us through the distressing physician shortage and also to promote the diversity that we've been talking about, we want to welcome David Skorton. He is the president and CEO of the Association of American Medical Colleges. Dr. Skorton, thank you for being with us today. And I can tell you firsthand, my wife is a primary care nurse and she is dealing with this every single day. Why such a problem when it comes to a shortage of doctors and medical providers?
Well, first of all, congratulations on these interviews. I've had a chance to watch a bit of it, and very, very important things that you're doing, and I really congratulate you on that.
Thank you.
Well, throughout the healthcare sector, we're running into staff shortages, and this is not something brand new, but it's getting worse. Why? First of all, Steve, except for you and I, the nation is aging. And as the nation ages, we get more people who need more help, more care. Secondarily, the medical workforce, like the rest of the country, is also aging. And as they age, more and more of them will come to retirement age, especially those in my generation, the so-called baby boomers. Thirdly, COVID has really taken its toll on the healthcare workforce. This is a very difficult, previously unknown to us, multi-system lethal disease that really, really took the wind out of the sails of a lot of healthcare workers. And the mental stress on the healthcare workers drove some of them to reduce their hours or even leave the profession. And right now we're facing these shortages in a big way. Now on the physician front specifically, the Association of American Medical Colleges, my organization, has for years been doing a careful science-based projection of physician shortages going over the next decade, whatever year it is. And we have shortages right now of primary care physicians and those in behavioral health and those in rural areas. And we're projecting up to 124,000 physician shortage by roughly 2034. So this is a problem that's been going on, made worse by COVID, worse by the aging of the workforce, and we're facing some real challenges.
And again, a reminder for those of you watching that you can join the conversation on Twitter at The Hill Events. Dr. Skorton, I saw an article that included Cornell University, where you served as president, on how colleges and universities, especially medical schools, are trying to encourage foreign students to come to this country and study here and hopefully stay here. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm so grateful that you brought that up. Having a rational immigration system and doing what we can to support these really wonderful people who come over and end up being as much as a quarter of the workforce is incredibly important, including those that are in the DACA program, the DACA, D-A-C-A program. And I'm hoping, and we really need our political leaders to make sure that that program stays. The last time I looked at the statistics about a year ago, roughly 30,000 healthcare workers, physicians and others, would lose their work authorization if DACA were rescinded. So we need to make sure that we have a rational system of immigration throughout the country, of course, but also in this particular area. We would be in very, very bad shape if it wasn't for the excellent healthcare professionals who come from overseas.
We have been talking about medical technology, the advances in our research and science, and yet despite all of this, the lifespan of Americans is beginning to drop, not extend. So why is that in terms of the physician shortage issue? How does that contribute to our own life expectancy?
Well, in the last 3 years or so, the many deaths, over 1 million deaths from COVID, have contributed to that reduction in life expectancy. Probably the most troubling thing, which you touched on with your last speaker, is the difference in different populations, the health inequities. And we can see a difference in the city I'm talking to you from right now, Washington, D.C., a difference across town in life expectancy of many years. And so that's the first thing to mention, is that the inequities, the differences in life expectancy by a racial or ethnic group, by those who have access to health care, have access to healthy food, have access to safe and humane housing, and other determinants of robust health, has been going on a long time. And those inequities were really laid bare by COVID, which, as we know, affected marginalized groups much more than majority groups in the country. So that's a part of what is happening. Furthermore, in other patient groups, in rural areas and in poverty-stricken areas, we're also seeing changes related to just lack of access to health care. And to get health care, we really need two things. You need access. There have to be health care professionals available. And then we need monetary insurance coverage to open the door to those practitioners. So all of these are factors that can limit life expectancy.
I want to come back in a moment to your work at the Association of American Medical Colleges, but you've also been on the front lines of a growing and concerning situation in Uganda regarding Ebola. What can you tell us?
Well, the Ebola virus, which is a lethal virus, there have been outbreaks before. This is an outbreak that started in Uganda of a little different virus than the last outbreak was. And this particular virus, the last time I checked the data, had not come to the United States. And in fact, when I sent a statement out with Dr. Rochelle Walensky, the CDC director, to practitioners around the country, what we were urging practitioners to do was to be aware that since there are no flights from Entebbe to the United States directly, that providers needed to be aware of the requirement to take a careful, extensive travel history to make sure that someone coming from another location in Africa might have also come from Uganda before that location. And so we don't have a problem with the outbreak in the United States right now. We do have assets in the United States that would allow us to deal with it, but it's a very, very serious disease, and we are keeping our eyes on it very carefully.
Thank you for shedding some light on a story that we continue to follow. Let me bring it back to the issue of physicians and the looming shortage. 10 years from now, in 2032, what will the U.S. be facing?
Well, our projection in 2034, basically the same thing you asked, is that we may see a shortage of up to 124,000 physicians. And I want to add one number to that. If today, Steve, those who do not have access to health care, as I've described it, access to a practitioner and insurance coverage, if they had access equivalent to those who are more fortunate, we would be short up to 180,000 additional physicians right now, not counting that projection of up to 124,000 shortage in addition to where we are now by 2034. So this is really serious business.
And without shortcutting the process, once you begin medical school through residency, how many years are we talking about, and how much of an investment in terms of tuition?
So after college is over, it's at least a 7-year requirement. I say at least, excuse me, because the 4 years of medical school, and depending on the postgraduate training, that can be from 3 years in the case of internal medicine, the beginning of my training, out to more specialties and subspecialties. My own training was 5.5 years after medical school, and some surgical specialties and others are even longer than that, 7 years or more. So it's a major, major commitment of one's life. And secondly, the cost of higher education in general, medical school in particular, is very, very substantial. In the case of a medical degree, those who choose to go into clinical medicine with that degree, which is most, will have a very, very, very high probability of being able to repay those debts and have a comfortable life. But that's easy for me to say. The idea of looking forward to a $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 debt when one is in, say, high school, or when a family with a child in middle school is thinking about contemplating the possibility of a medical career, well, that can be daunting, and I believe it can talk people out of the possibility of even considering a medical career.
So final question in terms of getting the diversity among those would-be doctors, how do you get there?
That's a big question. I wish we had another hour to talk about that, Steve. I know we don't, so I'll make it quick. We really need to do a couple of things. One, we need to work on the populations in which we've had very little success bringing them into the medical workforce. Black men, American Indians, Alaska Natives, first-generation Americans. We need to do specific things on that. We're doing something very assertive through the Association of American Medical Colleges with an action collaborative relating to black men in medicine. Last week, we had a summit sponsored jointly with the National Medical Association. And there's a lot of other work that needs to be done. So that's one thing, is to have young people and their families see the possibility of a medical career way back in the educational lifespan, perhaps as early as middle school or even earlier. Then secondly, we have to make sure that we're doing everything we can to diversify the medical workforce. And Steve, as you well know, throughout higher education, including medical education, the Supreme Court next Monday on the 31st is going to hear arguments about the consideration of race in admissions. And this has been a very important factor to allow us to work toward diversification of the workforce. And I sure hope that we are still allowed to consider race as one factor in medical school admissions.
With the Association of American Medical Colleges, Dr. David Skorton, thank you very much for adding your perspective to this conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve. Congratulations on the summit.
And so that brings us to an end of our program. I want to thank you again, and our sponsors as well, Hologic, for their support of this program. And a big thank you to all of you for watching. And for those of you who missed any of the conversation this afternoon, we'll have the video on our website shortly. I'm Steve Scully, contributing here at Hill.com. Hope you enjoyed this program. Have a great rest of your day.